Welcome into another episode of Tailgate Talk SEC. I am Will Thomas, and today we're going through my biggest question or concern, however you want to put it, for each team. Now, obviously, in the summer, it's way more fun to be, excited, hyped up, talking about the strengths of each team, how they can each make a run, maybe pull some upsets. No team is perfect, right? It's important to try and get ahead and highlight where each team could be a little bit weaker this fall. So that's where, where their opponents can exploit them, but also where they need to focus on, in terms of camp, ahead of the season, ahead of their big games, to really make sure they can be the best team they possibly can. So we're just going alphabetically. We're going to touch on each team and what my biggest question and concern is for each squad. Starting off with the Alabama Crimson Tide. My biggest question is their running back room. And where does the ground production come from? Because last year, part of this was to the fault of their offensive line, obviously, but the running game was not good at all. They could not move the ball on the ground consistently, worth a damn. They had a couple games where they ran the ball well, but then, SEC championship, it was -3 rushing yards against Georgia. They couldn't do much against Indiana. And then you lose Jam Miller, who was a little bit beat up during the year last season, but he really was that workhorse guy. Looking at that room now, you have Daniel Hill coming back for his junior year. He had just under 300 yards last season, had 6 touchdowns though, but now he'll be the lead guy. But then you have Kevin Riley and AKD are back there, who are both sophomores with limited production. Xavier Crowell is a 5-star true freshman. Really excited about him. And Trayshawn Brown is also a true freshman in that room. But Bama's running game, it really can't be worse, right? So looking at it this year, just logically, it has to be better. The question is it better in a sense of, like I just said, where it just can't be any worse, so of course take a step forward? Or is it better in the sense where you have a new quarterback who's starting for you? Can it be good enough to sort of carry that quarterback through the first few weeks, through the first few games, to really help him get comfortable? And if it is, who's the leader? Is it Daniel Hill? Is he ready to be that workhorse guy? Is it one of the sophomores? Does Crowell immediately come in and be the lead guy as a 5-star player? There's a lot of questions there. So that is my biggest concern for Alabama, because their defense, I trust. Their receiver room is awesome, but that running game is really going to be that focal point for me of, can their offense be two-dimensional and not one-dimensional, stuck passing the ball like they were last year. Moving on to the Arkansas Razorbacks. My concern for them is that receiver. And there are enough talented dudes in that room where maybe on the surface level, it's not really clear why I'm questioning it, but none of these guys are really wide receiver ones. Or at least they haven't been in the past, I should say. They bring in Chris Marshall from Boise. He is a redshirt senior who had over 500 yards last year, only started in 5 games. So once again, not really the wide receiver one type, but he does have good numbers. He's 6'3", 222, so really good size there. Courtney Crutchfield is a redshirt sophomore who only had 1 catch last season for the Razorbacks. CJ Brown is a junior who did have 28 grabs for just over 300 yards last season. And then Donovan Fopple, he comes over from New Mexico State. He appeared in all 12 games last year. He was second team All-CUSA. And then Jamari Hawkins also comes over in the portal. He is from Memphis. He came over with Ryan Silverfield. He is a redshirt senior. And then Ishmael Sissy is back again in Fayetteville this year as well. So all those guys, they're good receivers, right? Those top 6 guys, there's not really a player there that I'm worried about being the weak link of the room. But I also don't see a proven receiver 1. I'm not really sure if I see a proven receiver 2, right? Because Donovan Fopple, he was second team All-CUSA last year, but that was at New Mexico in Conference USA. It wasn't in the SEC. So I do just have questions for Arkansas receivers in terms of who is going to step up and lead that room. Because the Razorbacks are also breaking in a new quarterback, whether that is KJ Jackson or AJ Hill. They're breaking in a new passer. So they're going to need reliable options to step up in that receiver room for them if they're going to be comfortable. And my question is, who is that going to be? Because obviously the Razorbacks' talent profile overall doesn't really match up with most of the SEC. So who can step up for them? Who can play sort of above their rating, above their projection, especially in that receiver room, to try and help Arkansas win a couple extra games this year? Moving on to the Auburn Tigers, my biggest question here is just, how does all of the USF transfer up to the SEC? Now, I have learned already from just bringing this up around Auburn fans. I am reminded a million times that USF, with a bunch of these players, went into Florida last year and took down the Gators. And that is true. That is incredibly true. However, Auburn fans believe this too. What makes an SEC schedule so much more challenging is doing it week after week after week after week after week and not really having that break. Not having a week to get healthy. Right? Like you do like in some other conferences. Like we saw Ohio State do it last year in the Big Ten. They're just resting guys in conference games. You can't do that in this league. And for USF going to Gainesville last year, that was a 1-game spot where you're punching up. You don't get a 1-game spot where you're punching up when you play 9 conference games. So I do just have questions about, how does Byron Brown play against SEC defenses 9 times a year? A guy like Nakai Davenport, a running back, he isn't the feature guy, but he'll be getting plenty of carries. How does he deal with taking hits from SEC linebackers week in and week out? Koger, Nimrod, Singleton, all that receiver. Can they constantly run routes? Can they deal with getting roughed up by SEC DBs? Then defensively, there are some less transfers that we're relying on from USF, but a guy like Gavin Jenkins at corner, can he hang with SEC receivers all year long? So the USF players, they're incredibly talented, right? I mean, we saw the Bulls be one of the best teams in the American really for a while, right? And it was around that core of guys. So I have no question about, them being really good football players, but can they be good players when you're on your sixth SEC game? Right, that's my question. And in terms of coaching, I trust Golesh. He's been in the SEC before, so he really knows what it takes. But the players' durability, their ability to play in the SEC week after week after week, that's where I have questions. Moving on to the Florida Gators. This is more of a concern than a question, but it is kind of that offensive line. And I'm concerned about it partly because so is John Summerall. This is really the area that he was pointing out as what they need to work on in the spring, and there's tons of new. So at offensive tackle, Egan Boyer is coming over from Penn State. He's a redshirt sophomore. And then Caden Jones, he does return at the other tackle spot. At guard, Najee Harris, he returns for his senior season, but TJ Shanahan comes over from Penn State. And then at center is Harrison Moore, who comes over from Georgia Tech. So we got 3 transfers who are projected to be starters on this offensive line. 2 from Penn State come over with Phil Trautwein, who is the new offensive line coach there in Gainesville. And Harrison Moore comes over with his OC, Buster Faulkner. So everybody has a degree of familiarity. And outside of Egan Boyer at tackle, who's one of the Penn State guys, they really all have a good bit of experience, right? Caden Jones, over 500 snaps last year. Najee Harris, almost 700 snaps last year. TJ Shanahan played in every game at right guard, and Harrison Moore played almost 700 snaps at center last season. So there's plenty of individual experience, and there's that familiarity with at least somebody, but they haven't played as a 5-stack unit. Right, and that's the biggest concern. Can 5 equal 1 on the offensive line? And because John Summerall himself kind of came out in the spring and said, that's our area of weakness, it is cause for concern because there's so many weapons on Florida's offense. Jaden Ball at running back, Dallas Wilson, VB3 at receiver, and so many more guys that their talent will be wasted this year if the O-line doesn't work out. So hopefully for the Gators, the offensive line does work out, but that is by far my biggest concern for Florida this fall. Moving on to their rival, Georgia Bulldogs. It's receiver for me. And Georgia's always kind of been, not always, I shouldn't say always, but in the past few years, they've kind of lacked that dynamic ability at receiver, right? They had Zachariah Branch last year. They've had guys like Colby Young, Dylan Bell. None of those 3 guys are in this room right now. So your top returner is London Humphreys, who is a very reliable senior, had less than 300 yards last season, though. They bring over Isaiah Canyon from Georgia Tech, who did almost break 500 yards last year. But then, Sokovia White-Helton is a sophomore. C.J. Wiley is a sophomore. Talon Taylor is a redshirt freshman. Caden Prothro was interesting to me because he was a really highly rated tight end, but he could also swap to receiver. He's 6'6", 230. So they could really use him in a bunch of different ways. If they use him at receiver, it does make them a little more dynamic, but even if it is Prothro and the rest of the guys, I do still have questions about, does Georgia have a dude out wide who can just go win a deep ball? Right, or who can make a massive contested catch? Because a guy like Humphreys, he did make clutch catches, but we can all agree that the dynamic receiving, that playmaking threat out wide isn't quite there. So for Georgia, the running game looks awesome with those 3 running backs. Can that be good enough to where the passing game can just be sort of do your job, right? Or will there be times that Georgia is in need of a dynamic pass catcher out wide to go make a play, and they just don't have one in a big spot? So obviously it's Georgia. It's Kirby. I trust that they will have what they need to get done, but the lack of explosiveness in a dynamic playmaker in that receiver room is really my biggest concern for the Bulldogs. Moving on to the Kentucky Wildcats, my biggest question there is at linebacker on defense. They have Antoine Smith coming back, who he did play in all 12 games last year, only had 6 total tackles. Grant Godfrey, a junior, played in all 12 games last year, only 34 total tackles. And then bring over Tavion Wallace from Arkansas, who is a sophomore I'm actually really excited about. I believe that he can be a very dynamic guy at linebacker, 6'1", 251. And Elijah Barnes is a redshirt freshman coming over from Texas, but he had 4 tackles last year. Right? Tavion Wallace only appeared in 9 games last year in very limited action. So Grant Godfrey is their most experienced returner at 6'3", 240. He is a junior, had 34 tackles, 2 TFLs, and half a sack last year. There's not really a defensive leader that we've seen in the past coming back for this linebacker room. And that's incredibly important to have for that core in the middle of your defense. So my biggest question and concern is who's going to be that guy? Who's going to be the leader of that defense from the linebacker spot? And then around him, obviously he can be the vocal leader. Can he also be the stats leader? Does he have help behind him? How's the depth of that linebacker room. So I do have a good bit of questions about the Wildcats linebackers. The rest of their defense does have enough to really rely on, where I feel like linebacker was the biggest question mark for me. But obviously, Grant Godfrey was a highly rated guy. Tavion Wallace, very highly rated blue chip guy. So there's tons of talent there, but can somebody step up, be a leader? Because Kentucky is going to need two, maybe even three of those guys to really make big time career leaps this fall. Moving to the LSU Tigers in Lane Kiffin's first year, my biggest concern here is DBs. And it's not because of the talent in the DB room. The starters are great, right? DJ Pickett, the five-star, who's a sophomore here. He was freshman All-SEC last season, had 3 picks. And then PJ Woodland, who was a junior. He started in all 13 games last year. He's only allowed 1 touchdown in 2 seasons. You get by those 2 guys, and I don't really know what I have. Right? There's already some depth issues because of some injuries in the spring. But a guy like Jakeem Jackson, who is a redshirt junior. He came over from Florida. What does he look like if he has to do extended snaps? Deshaun Spears, great player, really exciting junior. Can he be a starter, right, if he needs to be? Michael Turner, a redshirt sophomore, mostly on special teams last season. Is he ready to make a jump and be a consistent corner? I just have questions about the depth of that room. And, as we get to the end of the year, right, 9 SEC games, does a guy like DJ Pickett or PJ Woodland, are they just not 100% when, they play Texas or when they play Alabama, right? With these lethal playmakers out wide both those teams have, can a depth corner step up and make a play? Or, sorry, not just make a play, but shut down a Cam Coleman or a Latsier Brooks for 4 quarters. That's my biggest concern because LSU's defense is incredible. That front 7 is something gross. But if the defensive backs, they start to have some holes and some leaks in maybe middle to late of the year, that can all go to waste. So my biggest concern for LSU is those corners and how well they can hold up really as we get deep into the season. For Mississippi State, my biggest question here is where their defensive production comes from outside of the secondary. Their DBs and safeties are elite. Those are really high SEC caliber rooms. But then outside of that, there's a lot of question marks coming off the edge. Amari Williams, he's coming over from Florida State. Last year, he was only a part-time D end. He was also a tight end. So how does he transition to being an edge? Will Whitson, who only played in 2 games last year, did have 2 sacks. But he was coming off a season-ending year last season. Is he healthy? Is he ready to go? Is he tackle? A guy like Dylan Evans coming over from Texas A&M. How ready is he at linebacker? Zachary Tillman and Jalen Smith, can they really lead that room as a senior and a redshirt senior? The secondary I trust, right? Kelly Jones, Isaac Smith, Braylon Womack, even as a true freshman, as a 5-star. I trust that those guys can be leaders. In the front 7, is there any resistance, right, where they can allow the secondary to then be able to make plays? Is there a pass rush so Kelly Jones can be aggressive jumping routes? Is there run stoppability so the corners actually get reps, right, and they can showcase their skills and be productive? I don't always know about that. So hopefully for Mississippi State's sake, their defense in the front 7 really does round to form because their offense has tons of weapons. But my biggest concern is how is Mississippi State's defense, mainly that front 7, are they going to step up and be able to elevate their play? Because the DBs I trust, can the rest of the guys step up? Moving to the Missouri Tigers, also on defense. It's their edge production. That's my biggest question, right? So they're losing Zion Young and Damon Wilson off the edge. Zion Young is in the pros now. Damon Wilson is at Miami. How do you replace that much production coming off the edge? They have Darius Smith, who is a redshirt senior, had 5.5 TFLs and 4 sacks. Langdon Kitchen is another senior. He only had 13 tackles total. He was more of a rotational guy. And then behind those dudes, Jaden Jones is coming over from Florida State. He had 3 starts last year, had 7 tackles. And Dayton Hopkins is a redshirt freshman who only played in 4 last year. So Darius Smith, by far the leading production guy coming back. 16 tackles, 4 sacks, 5.5 TFLs. Obviously, those numbers are baked in that he was behind Zion Damon Wilson. But is he ready to take that jump as the guy coming off the edge, who they need 9 sacks from? Can Langdon Kitchen give him 7? Right, these guys who haven't done it yet, can they do it? That's always a cause for concern, especially in college sports. Because obviously, I'll be the first one to tell you this too. Just because someone hasn't done something doesn't mean they can't. That applies to both players and coaches. But it is fair to question, especially when it's, the players who were just behind superstars, can they then fill those shoes and elevate up? Because Missouri, they were very reliant on those edge guys getting pressure and wreaking havoc last season. If that's pulled from out from under them, it just gets way harder. They do have some really other good pieces on defense, but can they be great enough, right, if the edge production isn't there? So for right now, my biggest question for Missouri is off the edge. Can a guy like Darius Smith, a guy like Langdon Kitchen, replace what they're losing in those 2 elite guys from last season? The Oklahoma Sooners now. My biggest question here is the running game. It's very similar to Bama, where you could really point to most of the problems being based on the offensive line. But you bring Xavier Robinson back at running back. He's a junior. He played in all 12 games last year, had over 400 yards. Torrey Blaylock, as a sophomore, he was SEC all freshman last season, had 480 yards. Then Lloyd Avant comes over from Colorado State. He had 417 carries, 417 yards last year, excuse me. And Devin Walker is a four-star true freshman. Out of those four guys, right, I'm looking at Robinson, I'm looking at Blaylock, guys who were there last year. Can one of you run for 700 yards maybe? Right, I don't want to say 1,000 because John Mateer will also take up a good bit of those rushing yards. Right, so the running back numbers, similar to actually Vanderbilt from last year. I'll get to those guys in a minute. But just the running back numbers are a little bit low. That's not because the backs aren't good. It's because their quarterback is also taking a few hundred rushing yards. Right, so just for Robinson and Blaylock, even if the yards aren't there in volume because of Mateer or just the passing game, whatever it is, can they just be 4-yard per carry guys? Because last year they were not there. Last year, the yards per carry for this Oklahoma team was really bad, and it put them in bad spots, especially because when Mateer, his throwing hand had screws in it, and he wasn't ready. It made it way worse because you couldn't quite throw the ball consistently on top of a bad run offense, and they still made the playoff and hosted the playoff game. If this running game gets together and Mateer's hand is ready, guys, look out for Oklahoma. You really got to look out for Oklahoma, but a lot of that really does revolve around, can this rushing attack be viable this fall? For the Ole Miss Rebels, my biggest question is there a chance that Ole Miss's offense takes a step back this year? And I've already put this out as a short, and people had no idea what I was actually saying. They immediately misunderstood. Because Ole Miss's offense can still be very, very good and be worse than last year. Those can still be true. Ole Miss can go 16-0 and win the championship, and their offense can be worse than last year. Why I have the concerns, obviously, is because Lane Kiffin and Charlie Weis are gone. Those guys are geniuses on the staffing side of an offense. They're incredible at it. So you bring back Trinidad Chambliss, obviously. You bring back Kewan Lacey, obviously, those two superstars. And then Mekhi Frazier and Joshua Dye are there for depth in the running back room. You got some good receiver options. Deuce Alexander returns, and you bring over two guys from Syracuse in Daryl Gill and Jonte Cook. I believe that Caleb Odom at tight end could also break out this year. But if the scheme is just a little bit different, right? Not even if it's worse, just if it's different. Is Chambliss maybe a little bit less comfortable? Is Kewan Lacey not quite as explosive? Are the receivers not getting quite as much separation? Once again, this does not mean that I think Ole Miss is going to be bad. The offense last year was incredible. So it can be worse than last year and still be top 5 in the SEC. It's just a question of, with that much coaching turnover, that important coaching turnover, can Trinidad Chambliss, who is technically, he's a candidate for a sophomore slump, even though he's a sophomore, right? Because it's his second year as a starter. Is there a chance that Ole Miss's offense slows down just a little bit this fall? That's my biggest concern, and it's not because of the personnel, but it's because of the coaching changes. Going to South Carolina now. My biggest question here is their running back room. It's very similar to Oklahoma, right? Lenore Sellers is a good running threat, but you don't want him getting hit all the time. You do not want your quarterback to be your leading rusher. You just don't, because that's a lot of hits. It's a lot of being on the ground. You want him upright. So for the Gamecocks, who can step up and be a workhorse runner? Matt Fuller is a redshirt sophomore. He had 260 rushing yards last year. Christian Clark, redshirt sophomore, coming from Texas. He had 226 yards last year. Jawan Howell, redshirt junior, played in 5 games last year, 80 rushing yards last year. That is less than 500 combined rushing yards coming back among your top 3 running backs. That is not enough to be confident in what the room can be this fall. Now, could Matt Fuller or Christian Clark blossom into an elite runner? Totally. They're talented guys. You saw it in bits and pieces last year when they got their carries. They're good ball carriers. But my question is just, can they then be leaders of a room? Can they be 20 carry a game guys if that's what Carolina needs? So because of my concerns there, I'm a little bit lower on Carolina this year just because I don't see a great rusher. That's not Lenore Sellers. And if Sellers is the one who's to carry the ball, maybe he gets hit 12 or 15 times a game, it's just not sustainable. It's just not for a quarterback. So for Carolina, my biggest question is, can a running back elevate themselves to be a workhorse guy who they can rely on for 90 rushing yards a game? Because just that will be a massive boost for Carolina. Moving to the Tennessee Vols here, my biggest question is, how does this Jim Knowles defense blossom immediately? Or sorry, how well does it blossom immediately? Right, because Tennessee's defense last year, really, really bad. One of the worst in the SEC, among the worst in the country. So Josh Heupel went out and hired Jim Knowles from Penn State, who also had stops at Ohio State and Oklahoma State. He's one of the best D coordinators, I think, in the country. It's pretty safe to say. But the book on him is that it can take a few years to really fully get the scheme established. Now, for Knowles, there is some familiarity with him at Tennessee because he's bringing over Xavier Gilliam at the tackle from Penn State. He brings over Amari Campbell at linebacker, also from Penn State. And he did have Chaz Coleman, the superstar off the edge, but it came out last week that he is no longer with that program. So I also have questions about their edge room in general, but I figure for the purposes of this video, it's just how much does this defense change in year one? It's very hard to change units in just 1 year. But there is plenty of talent on this defense. In their secondary, right, Ty Redmond, who's pictured. He was freshman All-American at corner last year. They also bring over Kayin Lee from Auburn at the same position at safety. TJ Metcalf, Edris Farouk are there in that safety room. And the front seven should be fine even without Chaz Coleman. I trust David Hobbs and Gilliam at the tackle. Off the edge, I do have questions just because of how much of that room was pinned on Chaz Coleman when they were building this roster. But my biggest question for the Vols, it's not even their quarterback battle to me, even though that's still very in the air. But how does the defense under Jim Knowles look in just year one? Moving on to the final three schools here. Texas Longhorns. My biggest question is, does Arch Manning become who we thought Arch Manning can be? Right, last year there was all the hype about him being, the next coming of Jesus as a quarterback. It was never going to happen. It was his first year as a starter in the SEC. He opened at the defending national championships and then had to play through a tough SEC schedule. He wasn't even totally healthy. Now this year, right, because as last year went, you kind of saw Arch go like this. He was getting better and better as he was getting healthier and healthier. Now around him, Raleek Brown, Hollywood Smothers at running back, Cam Coleman, Khalil Lockett, Emmett Mosley at receiver. This offense is stupid. And Texas' defense is also really, really good, so there shouldn't be a whole ton of pressure on Arch to ever really have to play from behind. So can he make that jump? Can he be elite all the time, right? And not just in specific spurts? Because I have incredibly high hopes for Texas this year. I have them going 12-0, but a lot of that hinges on, can Arch Manning be a more consistent player and have all of the good really be most of his gameplay this year, as opposed to some of the bad that we did see mixed in last season? Moving on now to Texas A&M. My biggest question for them is similar to Missouri. How do you replace Cassius Howell on defense? Now, I do believe that A&M is very well equipped for this because they bring over Anto Saka from Northwestern off the edge. He's a graduate transfer, 6'4", 255. That's bigger than Cassius Howell, and he had 3 sacks and 2 forced fumbles last year. Now, those numbers aren't that big, but you cut his tape, it's clear that he's violent. I do believe that in this scheme, he can be kind of Cassius Howell 2.0. But then behind him, where's the help? Right, Marco Jones is a sophomore who just had 2.5 sacks and 3.5 TFLs last year. TJ Searcy is a senior, 6.5 tackles, a sack and a half last fall. And Sam Mpemba is a redshirt junior who only played in 3 last year. So if Anto Saka is elite, that's great. But if he's the only one, he is going to be minimized because teams can double team him. You saw it with Dylan Stewart last year. Elite pass rusher, he was the only one. So he really couldn't get free a bunch of opportunities at the quarterback. Anto Saka, I'm willing to trust. But can a guy like Searcy, can Marco Jones be just as dangerous on the other edge? Because Cassius Howell, he was the best one, but he wasn't really alone, and he also made everybody around him better on that D-line. So for Anto Saka, can you be an elite player who also makes those other 3 guys better because you can help them help you? So that's my big question for A&M is, can they replace off the edge? Same thing as Missouri. And then for Vanderbilt, the last one here, my biggest question is, what does this offense look like without Diego Pavia, Eli Stowers, and Trey Richardson? Pavia and Stowers are both pros. Richardson is over at Louisville now. And the only real known commodity, at least of a group here for Vandy, is that running back room. They bring back Cedric Alexander, they bring back MK Young, and they have Evan Hampton coming in, who is a blue chip freshman. At receiver, you have Junior Sherrill back. Right, he was their lead guy last year. And they also bring over Ja'Cory Thomas from ODU. He's a big body guy I'm really excited about. Cole Adams comes from Bama. You have Bryson Coleman, Joseph McVay, and Tristan Brown, who are all back with the program from last year. But then at quarterback, right, Jared Curtis, in all likelihood, he'll be the guy. 5-star flip from Georgia, top quarterback in the class. But is he really able to just go? It's very hard in this day and age for a true freshman, mainly at quarterback, to be able to just land on your feet and go, right, without much of a step back. And even just regardless, Curtis could have a really good year. The receivers could have a great year. Tight ends, led by Cole Spence, could have a great year. I have a hard time sitting here saying that, or being confident in the fact that no Pavia, no Stowers, no Trey Richardson, that the offense is as good as it was last year. Now, something I said with Ole Miss, that could be true, and Vandy could go 10-2 again. They could be even better this year than they were last year. But I still have concerns about the offense relative to their unit last year not being quite as explosive. Because with Jared Curtis, I kind of doubt he can come in immediately and be what Diego Pavia was to that program. Now, granted, and it could be anybody, not even just Jared Curtis. I'd have a hard time believing they could be what Diego Pavia was to Vanderbilt. So just because of that, I have some concerns about Vandy's offense, their consistency, maybe their explosiveness, just because of how many quality guys, especially big play guys, like Trey Richardson was, they lose those guys, right? So who's going to be able to step into that role and be this year's Trey? Can anybody be this year's Stowers? Can Curtis maybe be this year's Pavia? Tons of questions for me on the offensive side of the ball for Vanderbilt, so that is my biggest concern there in Nashville, and that'll do it. That's all 16 SEC teams, and my biggest question or concern for them, just highlighting some areas that fans might need to look out for as potential weaknesses for their team. So that does it for this video, this episode of Tailgate Talk SEC. If you have been enjoying my college football content and you want more SEC CFB previews every single day, subscribe to me here and follow me on Twitter. Daily content until we kick off in August. I've been Will Thomas, and I will see you next time.